to 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 Bob's remarks, but before we do, want to hear from you all as well. Yes, Peter.
Let me ask two questions. One is just sort of a clarification. I was trying to listen real carefully, Joel, when you were describing the Safer Alternatives Act, and I heard a lot of talk about win-win solutions, about helping, about encouraging. When Bob responded, he talked about requirements, but he never mentioned any requirements or carrots or sticks. And so that's the clarification question. The other question is sort of a more structural question, which I'm really intrigued by. At least as I'm hearing it, and I'd be interested to know if I'm hearing this right, it sounds like this is an area where states, including some economically quite successful states like Massachusetts and California, have been sort of leading the pack in being more aggressive about regulating. There are obviously other areas, some that I pay a lot of attention to, where when you have different states doing different things, you get races to the bottom. This is an area where that doesn't appear to be happening, although, Bob, you're saying it's a risk. And I'm just wondering if there are things about this area that make it less prone to races to the bottom, more prone to races to the top in each of your views.
Let me go quickly through. One of the people who's here is Elizabeth Saunders from the Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow, which is a coalition of the state level of labor, environmentalists, public health professionals who have been promoting the act for several years. I don't know, do you have a fact sheet on the bill?
Not on me that would answer that question.
Okay, well let me just walk through the process, because I got into broader view. So basically what the law would require is first that the state develop a prioritization of the chemical universe in Massachusetts into higher lower concern, which is sort of doing under the Toxic Use Reduction Act right now, identifying higher hazard chemicals. This would take a broader view of the whole chemical universe in the state. It did it several years ago. From there, the advisory committee would set up a high priority list of chemicals for alternatives assessments. Then the Toxic Use Reduction Institute at UMass Lowell would do an alternatives assessment for the highest concern functional uses of those chemicals. Again, something like formaldehyde has 100 different functional functions. So it would take the highest concern functional uses, do the alternatives assessment in a stakeholder fashion, then print out, have a report that then DEP and the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs would develop an action plan based on that alternatives assessment, including, what restrictions might need to take place, timelines, technical support needs, etc. So there are, in the action plan, feasibly there could be requirements to phase out a particular chemical. And then based on that, there would also be requirements for out-of-state companies to submit information on what chemicals and what products, so that you would get that information. And then there were R&D support measures built in. In terms of the race to the bottom, race to the top, this is one of those areas where I think a handful of states have taken leadership and actually starting to work together. There's a group of 10 states called the Interstate Clearinghouse on Chemicals. It's coordinated by the Northeast Waste Management Officials organization here in Boston, NUMOA. And these are Washington, California, Oregon, Maine. Well, Maine, maybe not anymore, given their changes in politics. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. These are states that are trying to move this forward. They've understood that the federal government is at least 5 to 10 years away from doing anything and want to move at their own pace and their own level. I mean, I think this is just the history of environmental policy in this country. Is the states are the innovators. They push the federal government to do something. We're seeing that. So, and I think there's a much stronger interstate collaboration here than, in climate change it's similar, right? The states collaborating through RGGI and other initiatives. So I think that's why you're getting that push to the top, is really some state leadership saying, no, this is the way we're going to set the bar. We're going to set the bar high rather than low.
But why isn't business moving to Michigan?
They're a member of the Interstate Clearinghouse.
In the end. I'll answer a couple. Everything that Joel said would be done under the new act can be done under Torah. Okay, we do prioritize chemicals on the Torah, and in fact, I know they have prioritized several chemicals on the Torah. They can do an alternatives assessment. In fact, several years ago, they did do, I think it was 5 chemicals at the time. Didn't they do a 5 chemical assessment?
Yeah.
Where they actually looked at these particular 5 chemicals, came up with alternatives. And it's ironic because several of the chemicals that they found were not actually in products, but were used like in hairdressing salons and things of those natures, you know, sort of an unregulated area. And some of them actually could have been banned under the Department of Public Health regulations if they were dangerous enough. And it was surprising that what Joel says is, you know, we're going to prioritize all the chemicals that are used here in the state. Well, first of all, we have that information. But secondly, the chemicals used here in the state are not the problem. The chemicals that are coming from outer state are the problem. And to keep hopping and keep, going after the product manufacturers in this state, I think is getting us diminishing returns. And in fact, it's diminishing returns in the sense, not only are we getting less chemicals and getting less results, but in fact, there's less companies to go after. So if you want to do a prioritization in the region, do a prioritization in the country, let's talk about it. But if you just want to say, oh, we're going to prioritize the companies in Massachusetts, and then we're going to, start looking at their substitutes, and then we're going to start requiring, and it is really a requirement. If it meets certain guidelines, it is actually a requirement you not use it, you not use the chemical. And, it's a simply misplaced priority. We would be far better off continuing on the cooperation, getting real results, and using case studies to bring more information to the people into this clearinghouse, which Joel was talking about. But one of the things I think we found out when we did the 5 chemical assessment several years ago, that there were few companies in Massachusetts that actually did the same thing. So formaldehyde is a good example. You might think, well, let's look at all the companies using formaldehyde in Mass, and then direct that they use an alternative, and then they'll use it. What they found out was there were so many different processes that might use formaldehyde that there wasn't one magic bullet that would actually be a substitution. Something might work in this case, and it wouldn't work in this case, and it might work or might not work in this case. And just the final notion is, what Joel said, where some of the substitutions may turn out to be worse than what we've actually looked at. And some of those, by the way, were requirements of the government. Some of the substitutions were things that were suggested by the government, which are now turning out to be not exactly as clean as they would. So we got to tread carefully, and we have to go after those companies, those products, those chemicals that are causing problems, and not really do this window dressing, which I think the Safer Alternatives Bill is.
Can I just respond quickly?
Sure.
I mean, I think I'm not in much disagreement with many of the statements you said. I think this is a really debate about what's the role of federal government versus state government. I would arguably say Massachusetts companies are, Massachusetts has been a leader in helping support companies and requiring companies to start looking at those alternatives. We still do have, and I think I would argue that, and you would probably agree that probably the biggest problems we're facing in the state have to do with chemicals in products coming from out of state. So I would love to see, I think all of us would love to see a national solution. I'm not sure we're going to get that anytime soon. And so and I disagree though that, I think you're right. If you could use a dangerous chemical in a production process in Indiana and send it in a product here that doesn't necessarily have that chemical, and you can't do it here, you could argue probably that it would put Massachusetts firms at a competitive disadvantage. But does that mean, though, that we should allow Massachusetts companies to potentially harm workers in the environment because someone else over there can't do it? If we had a perfect world, I think we would have a national solution. Though there is a role for federal and state government. Federal government has toxicological resources, scientific resources. I always think about alternatives assessment at a sort of 30,000-foot view and a 2,000-foot view. So the 30,000-foot view is what does the toxicology say? What are the alternatives? The 2,000-foot view is how do I make it work in my production system tomorrow? And that's where state government has an important role of helping to shift and support. And
Yeah.
Question here.
Okay, I have actually 2 questions that are completely different. The first one is, So we agree that national policy would be ideal. It's not going to happen, and there are some problems doing it on a state-by-state basis. But there's also precedent in certain kinds of regulations, say California leading the way in appliance efficiency. And industry was, kicking and screaming, but it turned out not only could they produce appliances cheaper, but more efficient. And eventually that state, being such a big market, changed the whole industry. Similarly, you could say that California attempted the same thing with car fuel efficiency standards. So when you described, Joel, earlier all the business transition, Walmart and so forth, what is the possibility that you've got these 10 leading states, agreeing that it sounds like markets are transitioning already, or is it, but I mean, you mentioned mostly retailers. Is this going on a lot in products?
It's happening in major products. So if you take, for example, apparel and footwear, and we've got Massachusetts companies like New Balance, they are pushing that envelope. This is leaders like the Nikes, the New Balances, saying to the apparel and footwear industry, we got creamed on child labor and a bunch of toxicity issues. We better be at the forefront. So they've got a list of about 900 chemicals that are regulated somewhere in the world that they want to avoid in footwear and apparel products. And I agree. I mean, these companies are getting worried that there's 19 different sets of regulations, and these are forward-looking companies that want to do the right thing, and they're struggling with all these different, state policies and trying to figure out what do we do. But the marketplace, I think there's the marketplace in voluntary support works well for leaders. It doesn't work well for stragglers. So you need something to force the stragglers as well to have to do the changes, or else the leaders are at a disadvantage. So one example here in Massachusetts is a small chemical company, Alpha Chemical Services, which makes cleaning products. They actually supply Cisco, the big procurement organization, and their statement, their vice president's statement about, for example, safer alternatives is, we actually need this because we make a safer product and we want to be promoted in the marketplace. And we've got the alternative already there. I mean, this is the DuPont and CFC's example, right? You ban the CFCs, DuPont already has the alternative ready. So if we have Massachusetts companies that already have the alternatives ready, they're at the advantage when it comes to restrictions happening.
Yes,
I have a question. You were saying that, and we read about it in the paper, the way the market has actually responded more quickly than government can. But what is driving that? Is this consumer activism, environmental activism? People won't buy these products once they've been alerted to them? What? It seems a little too simple for that.
Some of it is a little bit odd, I think. I was at a store and I was buying something, and there was a big thing that said no BPA. It had a circle. Right. Then it had BPA, and then it had next to it. And I wonder how many people picking that up actually knew what that was. They knew it had no BPA, and maybe they've heard of the word BPA, and maybe thinking that not having it in there might be a good idea. But I doubt, if I took a survey of 100 people who bought that product, I doubt, first of all, any of them even cared, to be honest with you.
Okay, but why is the company doing it then?
Well, I think
people
they
don't know and don't care.
Well, no, but I think they think there is something out there for them, and I simply, the consumer studies haven't really shown that people are going for those safer products. But hey, if they want to do it, we have no problem with it. I mean, I don't care what's driving it. I mean, if Walmart says they want no BPA and they want a list, and they think it helps, I don't have any problem with it, really.
What do you think about that, Joel?
I think you could look at organic foods as the largest growing area of the food industry as an example that, when the organic standard came out, 300,000 comments on that standard, probably the most comments on any government environmental standard out there. People do care, actually. And I think, the drivers are multiple-fold. Some of them are failures, foibles where you have a dangerous chemical in your product. So Nike took a hit because their the German national soccer team's jerseys had a chemical called tributyltin in them, and it was all over the news, that Nike was poisoning the German national soccer team. And that's just something you don't do. That's like deadly, especially when you live off of their sponsorship. Others, child labor, but usually there's some kind of problem that has happened that forces. In Walmart's case, a lot of it had to do with they were getting hit by waste regulations. So, but I think there is an increased consumer consciousness about chemicals and products that, and I would disagree. I think people on the street, I ask my students all the time, do any of you know BPA? They don't know, but before they've even had me as a professor, do you know what BPA is? And they all do. Phthalates.
I've no doubt that they know what these products are. I'm just not sure that they know, whether or not it's even hurting. I think they respond to the media that tells them it's hurting them. Okay.
Of course.
And I've done these kind of surveys in my class, and we go through a lot of products that are hurting you, and soda's been told that it's going to hurt you, and all these other products. And then I ask my students, well, do you have a laptop computer? Oh yeah. Do you have a BlackBerry? All of which contain mercury, all of which contain all these other toxic chemicals that they seem not willing to give up. So I guess if they have to give up BPA in a plastic bottle, that's not really a big problem. Right. I doubt any of them are going to give up some of the. And I've also asked them, by the way, if they make some of their purchasing decisions based upon the company's sustainability programs, and surprisingly, very, very, very few do. Okay. Not to say that if the company has it, it's not a good thing. I think every company should have a good sustainability program and should be transferring to these things. But comparing this to the organic food movement, I think is a little bit different. Because people can understand organics and people can understand pesticides. I'm not sure a lot of people understand bisphenol A and phthalates. Simply don't. But if we can move away from them and we have safer alternatives, let's do it. But nowhere on their package that I purchased, and actually have it back in my office, does it say what the substitute was.
Right. And
nowhere. Okay, it says no BPA. It doesn't even say bisphenol A. It just says no BPA. Nowhere does it identify the substitute. So we could have people putting themselves in harm's way. I simply don't know. And that's one of the failures, I think, of this whole process.
Well, let's get a few more questions. I think.
Well, actually, and the question is sort of takes off from where you were already talking in some respects. That is, this is a classic example of, here we have a question about the nature of risk, and to what degree citizens can understand, measure, sort of do something about risks. And it's one thing, I think, a generation ago when we were dealing with sort of bulk chemicals, or we're dealing with things like lead or mercury, people had a basic understanding of these kind of substances. And yet today, one could argue that we're asking individuals, when we get into the consumer sort of construct about give people more information, for example, is always one argument, and they'll make good market decisions. And that's true under some conditions, and yet if you look at this area of chemicals, for example, and a lot of other emerging technologies that we think about, we're asking people to make decisions about potential risks that they can neither understand scientifically themselves, nor can they actually figure out what the trade-offs are oftentimes, because they're not understanding the risk factors. And so the question is what role government plays versus, say, the private market plays in either measuring those risks, communicating those risks, weighing the risks, all those kind of things. The whole question of risk is really wound up in this. And so we're sort of heading that direction anyway with the conversation, but I thought I'd ask that very straightforward question. How do we deal with the question of risk? And how?
Yeah, it's a very challenging thing, and if you talk to a lot of companies, they believe social risk has to be in the equation, right? If the consumer thinks that what we're doing is dangerous, and there's a whole part of the risk literature that talks about lay people being much better at predicting uncertain risks than scientists. We're not very good. We're very narrow-minded, very reductionist in our approach, and I think the BPA debate about the science is a great one. That you have one set of scientists here saying it's the worst chemical ever created. You have another set of scientists saying it's safe as water, and so when the scientists can't even agree, there's a problem there. So I think this is where government has a role to help identify what makes things safer and help support that. These are the things that make it safer. So a very nice program the EPA has right now, one of the bright lights of the EPA is their Design for Environment program, and small, tiny, little underfunded program, but what they do is they do alternatives assessments. They identify criteria for what makes a chemical less or more toxic, then review and look at alternatives in partnership with industry, the nonprofit, to identify what the alternatives are and then to populate the marketplace with those alternatives. So for cleaning chemical ingredients, they have the minimum criteria that a safer cleaning chemical ingredient has to have. Industry then populates that database, and their toxicological studies are third-party certified. And then the formulator can go and say, I want this one, this one, this one, that are all meet those minimum criteria. And then the purchaser gets a logo on a bottle that says this has been reviewed by the EPA to say that it uses the safest available ingredients. And so the risk equation, a lot of folks in the eco-labeling movement would say the public doesn't, they can't, this is just too complex. To have a label helps to narrow down that risk decision. There are others who would argue, in addition to that, disclosure is really important. So you see a lot in the cleaning chemical industry, a lot of debate now about ingredient disclosure, which SC Johnson's moving to, and certain other, like Clorox, is moving to. So it's not simple. It's
what happens if the government says something's safe, but the public doesn't believe the government? I think bisphenol A is a pretty good example. As far as I know, except for sippy cups and baby bottles and some under 3 stuff, the government says that the FDA has repeatedly said it's safe. Now, they are continuing to do more studies, I get it. However, the government has come out, the FDA has come out and said bisphenol A in most applications is completely safe. What's the reaction? Let's do another study. Congressman Markey comes out and says, we don't believe the FDA. Let's do another study. Okay, so when Joel talks about 2 scientists, as a scientist myself, I can certainly understand how 2 scientists come up to different conclusions. But when the government comes out and says something safe, is that the end of the story or is it not the end of the story? Because if that were the end of the story, we wouldn't be spending millions and millions of dollars to give more studies to the FDA to prove that it's dangerous. Somewhere we got to stop. And
Actually, let me follow up with that, because I think you're pointing to a dilemma here, and that is, the message that came from the FDA was rather nuanced, that bisphenol A should not be exposed to children under a certain age. And yet, in an age of hyper-information,
that's exactly what I'm saying.
Consumers don't hear that nuance.
I agree.
And so that creates even greater dilemma for this relation between, say, regulated and regulated. I mean, this really dilemma: how do you regulate risk in an environment of hyper communication, instantaneous, communication, in a world where people think? For example, we have the classic example of the thimerosal, thimerosal in vaccine, and the scientific studies say there's no connection between this and autism, and yet there's a significant population out there who believes, based on essentially a discredited study, that there is truth there. There is true, and yet, so how do you balance?
And that's
this
a great
out?
example, because the alternative to that was not taking a measles vaccine in this case, or an MMR vaccine. And there's far more studies that show you that not taking the vaccine is far more dangerous. In many developing countries, measles kills thousands and thousands of people. It's far more dangerous than taking it. But you're absolutely, positively correct that the nuances of these very, very technical studies is lost on the average population. And I think by feeding into that, by continually saying bisphenol A, bisphenol A is the example we're using here. By continually saying, no bisphenol A, no this, no that, we're feeding into that fear, and we're confusing the public even more. And I don't think we're making the public any safer. That's the worst part. We're spending an enormous amount of resources, an enormous amount of money, and in many cases, I simply don't think the public is any safer at all.
Barry.
I wonder if I could, I think, follow up in the same line of questioning, and that is, Joel, you kept talking about we have a safe, cost-effective substitute for a given chemical.
Safer. I never use
Safer. In those cases where we don't have one, or we'll have one but it's 10 years away, what kind of cost-benefit analysis do we do to suggest whether we should simply not use a particular chemical, either because it's dangerous in the production of a product or dangerous in the consumption of the product? You were just saying here, comparing the measles vaccine, there may be some tiny danger to 1 in 100 million people with most injections.
Mhm.
And yet we weigh that the benefits outweigh the cost. How is that done in terms of chemicals under either the Toxic Use Reduction Act or the earlier, or the new, safer, the new bill?
I mean, on the new bill, a lot of the economics was punted to say there has to be a process for considering costs in there.
Mhm.
But to leave that to government to figure out that process, because I tend to think that traditional cost benefit analysis is not a very useful tool for looking at chemicals or environmental regulation in general. I think what you tend to do is discount health and safety benefits of regulation, and you put a lot of the emphasis on the current cost of compliance. So, if you're thinking about alternatives that are on the horizon, that's 10 years out. So we're looking at immediate costs, and the health and safety costs. We know that disease is very difficult to quantify, right? You can use adjusted life years, you can use lots of surrogates but in the end, they're real costs, right? They're real costs to the people who get disease. We can look at the cost of not taking action, right? We can look at asbestos, we can look at PCBs, we can look at a whole set of chemicals and say what happens when we don't take action to the economy. So in the end, I think what we need to do is we need to think about the costs, but also to think about what are the potential benefits in the long term. I mean,
The benefits
of acting, right?
Of
we
acting
often
against
think about, what are the costs of acting? Well, what are the benefits of acting? I mean, the thimerosal example is not a great one from a public health perspective, and I'm trained in public health. It's really not a smart idea to be injecting mercury into people's arms. And if you look at the reason why the thimerosal is used, it's a preservative, so you can have bigger batches, right? Just having a single option, you either vaccinate or don't vaccinate, doesn't consider all the potential options in the middle there, right? Is there an alternative preservative that you could use that doesn't have mercury? So in the cost issue of thinking about something that's not on the horizon, well, how do we put the R&D effort into finding that alternative that would lower the cost profile in the long term? Maybe we don't act today. Maybe there are certain things that we could be doing today that are low cost, and we often find that in toxic use reduction. There are low or no cost options to be able to implement today while we put some R&D money into finding solutions. I'll give you one example on BPA. The National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences put $30 million into studying the mechanisms of BPA. Again, a chemical that there's debate. I actually think the FDA's risk assessment is a pretty bad risk assessment. It's based on old science and old understanding about chemicals, not about current understanding about endocrine disruptors. But not a single dollar went into looking at alternatives, for example, in tin can linings and understanding. We have a colleague at UMass Lowell who's a plastics engineer who, for $25,000 with Toxic Use Reduction Institute funding, is looking at the alternatives, but with $25,000 versus $30 million to study how bad the chemical is. If you look at the money that's going into environmental protection, and we sort of look, it's probably $10 for studying problems for every dollar of studying solutions. So if we actually put some effort into studying solutions, we may find those cost-effective, beneficial alternatives that actually do lower costs rather than simply doing the traditional static cost-benefit analysis. What do we have today versus, what are the costs of complying? Because it is expensive to comply with regulations. I mean, that's why this whole field of green chemistry is evolving, right? How do we design chemicals that are intrinsically safer by design, that are, and one of the key criteria is they have to be cost effective, because they're not useful if they're not cost effective. I'm not an economist, so I'm spewing here.
And neither am I, frankly, but I deal with companies who really take this very, very seriously. And the fact that this bill punted the cost effectiveness is exactly why this bill is a bad bill. Okay? Because they don't want to take the hard look at whether or not this is actually doing any good and whether or not it's actually feasible. They just want to throw out these things that talk about, we're going to look for a safer alternative. And we're only going to require you to go to it if it's cost effective. What's cost effective? Well, we don't know. We'll discuss that later on. Safer is, it's funny Joe brought up the thimerosal because, as you said, people were freaked about the vaccines even if they didn't contain thimerosal in them. I mean, there were studies that show that people were were concerned about vaccines that never had thimerosal. And it's part of that fear that, oh God, if a vaccine contains thimerosal, it's bad. Perhaps we can live with that one. Look for alternatives, etc. But what it turned into was all vaccines are bad, okay, or at least those vaccines that were part of these studies. And unless we're willing to do a life cycle analysis on every product out there, the definition of safer tends to go with whoever's doing the talking. And I use the example of solar energy constantly because the Toxic Use Reduction Institute came up and print showed that manufacturing solar energy panels uses some of the most toxic chemicals that are out there. Now, if you were to compare solar energy using chemicals, which can be managed, and which are managed under current laws, to, let's say, a coal-fired power plant, perhaps you would. In fact, I actually think that would still be a tough thought, because it depends on how far back you want to go, and it depends on what your risk is.
Right.
However, if you compare it to natural gas, you might find using natural gas is far safer than using solar energy. And I think because we have these other groups saying clean tech, clean tech, and clean tech, they refuse to believe that some of their own clean tech things are actually worse than what they're trying to make us move from. And until we do a life cycle analysis of every product and seriously talk about where we are in the environmental stage, I don't think we'll ever get to where this bill is, and that's simply one of the reasons why we oppose it.
Let me just follow up very quickly.
Very quickly.
I mean, I think, Bob, you're right. This is where not thinking about this assumes that innovation is static, right? That you can only make solar panels using toxic chemicals. Actually, John Warner and the Warner Babcock Institute are developing less toxic ways to make solar panels. Of course, we don't want to move to an energy that isn't. But let me get back to your point, Barry, because I think it's important. As a scientist, I'm held to 95% certainty that my results weren't by chance alone. Yet, I don't think economists are held to that same level of empirical evidence. And I've had these debates with Cass Sunstein at OMB, where he has sent me an article with all these things about how precautionary regulation are going to do all these things to the economy. I was like, where's the evidence, Cass? And then he says, well, if you took precaution, then we would not do anything. And, same John Graham type arguments that I don't think are very useful. I'd like to see empirical evidence that, chemicals regulation actually causes companies to leave the state or or causes a downturn in the economy, because I don't think we're going to have it. So,
Joel, the difference is when you get the chemicals wrong, a few people die. When we get our equations wrong, 40, 50 million people lose their jobs. And many of them die.
Yeah.
We're very much more dangerous than you are.
I think we had a comment in the back.
I have a question. Wondering if Joel, if you could talk a little bit to this question that came up earlier about how do we deal with products coming in from out of state, because one of the, as Joel mentioned earlier, I work with the Alliance for Help Me Tomorrow, which promotes this bill, so I just want to add that one of the things that's been alluded to but not said in specific is that one of the major thing that this bill does that the Toxic Use Reduction Act does not is looks at consumer products, which is where a lot of us are being exposed on a daily basis, and so it's a very important element of it. And this piece about Bob's talking about BPA and the fact that we don't know, the bottle has a label, but we don't know what that means, and we don't know what the alternatives are, is an exact example of why we need the safer alternative bill. Because when those bottles come out as BPA free, we want to make sure that they are replaced with a safer alternative, and that for that product that we're now addressing, that we have looked at the full range of options and chosen the safer one. So and because consumers shouldn't have to be toxicologists in order to buy a safe water bottle or whatever other product we're going to look at. So anyway, I just wanted to see if you could say anything about this. Products coming in from out of state.
I mean, I think it's a huge issue, and we know that Bob is absolutely right that to get information on what chemicals or in what products that then are being used in manufacturing in Massachusetts or sold in that information doesn't flow between below a level or two levels on a supply chain. So just understanding how for example, mercury regulation at the state level was an enormous challenge to get the data on what chemical, what products contain mercury. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, right? The fact that it's difficult doesn't mean not. I think until we have a federal chemicals law, the states are going to have to be looking at chemicals and products and trying to track those. And And it does adversely affect our state to not have some ability to regulate chemicals and products. Also, I think the difference between what the states can do and what the federal government can do is we're not bound by the same jurisdictional boundaries that happen at the federal level. For example, BPA in water bottles is an FDA issue, but who has the skills to look at the alternatives is EPA, the Design for Environment program. They're looking at BPA, but they can only look at BPA and thermal tape because that's FDA's bailiwick. And I've been in debates with FDA, CPSC about lead and the EPA, where FDA says the kid's lunchbox that contains lead, the inside of that lunchbox is our jurisdiction. CPSC says the outside of the lunchbox is our jurisdiction, and then nothing happens because there's fights. So at the state level, there's an ability to go beyond those jurisdictional boundaries. Chemicals are regulated in a different way at the state level and the local level. If you think about it, your local hazardous waste manager, or even your state people, see BPA or chemical in cosmetics or chemical in toys as those are chemicals. At the federal level, cosmetics are FDA. No pre-market testing, no requirements. Actually, their standard of evidence at the federal level is based on the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, which is adulteration, right? Dumb standard, right? You're never going to prove it. So the states have a lot more ability to innovate than the federal government at this point, unless we change the whole federal government, which is not going to happen. Even in TSCA reform, it's very clear that they did not want to touch anything that touches FDA or CPSC because that meant other committees in Congress, and it was going to be a real pain in the neck. So,
ironically, the funding for this program comes from the existing users of chemicals here in Massachusetts. Okay, and this is another big problem we have. Most of the money is going to be spent on looking at out-of-state and out-of-country issues, yet those people, frankly, will not pay one dime. So what we end up with is continually taxing the companies that are doing something, including, by the way, a company that might be selling into the EU, where BPA, as far as I know, is still allowed to be used. You could have a company using BPA selling into the EU, and they're going to be paying taxes to make sure that products don't come into Massachusetts with BPA. And it simply makes no sense at all. If there are chemicals out there that are concerned, the Department of Public Health has jurisdiction to ban those chemicals, and they can do that in certain products, and they have done that in certain products, and they can continually do that. What we don't need is another layer of Massachusetts-only government going out there, claiming that they have all the answers, and simply then going after the same old here in Massachusetts, and that's the basic problem with this thing. There's no way you would effectively, that watch, for instance, would be a great example. It's probably made with toxic chemicals. It may even have toxic chemicals in it. You know, there may be some lead, there may be some mercury, there may be some cadmium. I really don't know some of the mechanisms. So that could have hundreds and hundreds of suppliers. Some of which may in fact be here in Massachusetts. I mean, it may be, you know, somebody makes the timepiece, it goes to China, it gets a coating, comes back over to someplace, and then it ends up in your watch. And if you think that manufacturer of that watch is going to identify every toxic chemical in that, it's simply wrong. So we'll have to exempt that one because we can't figure it out. And it
Joel,
goes
we
on and
hope
on
they
and
take
on.
it with you and not leave it.
That's a dangerous. I don't even like to sit next to that thing.
Let's have one more
It's like the
question.
Coke
There's this gentleman here.
Actually, I have a question. Has there been regulations on chemicals for immunizations that are used that are given to children in the beginning stage of their lives? Because I know that in the last 30, 40 years, it's been a significant increase in the amount of immunizations from like the ages from birth to 8 years old.
I mean, that would be all FDA that would review them, look at the safety and efficacy. What the government did set up was, through the Institute of Medicine, a system for children who are, there's a demonstrated association that the vaccine caused an adverse reaction. There is a compensation scheme for those people, but the regulation would be through the FDA channels, and certainly there's been a lot of debate. And thimerosal, for the most part, is out of vaccines now.
For years.
Yeah. So there are certainly ongoing debates about the science, but this would be through the FDA, and then if a child is identified as having been harmed by a vaccine, they would be compensated.
Well, it is 1:30. I know there's more questions. Maybe our speakers can stick around for a few minutes afterwards. I wanted to thank everyone for coming. I found this to be a really interesting discussion and debate. I think one thing we can all take away from this is that states are where policy is being made and will be made going forward. Peter's question about, why aren't we seeing a race to the bottom? Well, I think when we've seen a vacuum at the top in terms of federal legislation, states are stepping in to fill a void, as they've done in the greenhouse gas area, where Massachusetts has taken leadership. In this area of product policy, states are doing the same. More than 20 years ago, Massachusetts was the first state to enact the Toxic Use Reduction Act. Many other states have now followed a similar model with similar legislation. But here we see Massachusetts again stepping up to go beyond the requirements of that legislation. So stay tuned. We have already posted on the seminar website a copy of the legislation. And Elizabeth, if you could send me a fact sheet on the bill, I think people would benefit from that as well. But if you have other materials that you'd like us to share with the group, and the video of today's presentation will be available there as well. So thank you all very much, and see you next month.